Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Henriette. I'm the Adult Programming Director at the J, and welcome to another presentation supported by ASU Jewish Studies. I'm here to introduce Stan Mervis, the Director of Jewish Studies, and I want to say a specific thank you to Lisa Kaplan, Assistant Director of Jewish Studies, who has been so supportive of everything we do at the J. So welcome. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Stan, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Henriette. Appreciate that. Welcome everybody here. It's my great honor, on behalf of Jewish Studies at ASU, to welcome for the second time Professor Michael Cherlin, who this is the second installment of a three-part series. Michael Cherlin was born into a Yiddish milieu in the Bronx in September of 1946. Michael's mother was the only sibling of three born in America, her parents and her brother and sister having immigrated from Galicia. Michael's father was the sole surviving child of Lithuanian Jews. He immigrated from Vilna to the U.S. as a teenager in the 1920s. Early in his career, Michael was a performing musician. As he approached the age of 30, Michael began pursuing a scholarly career, eventually earning a PhD in music theory from Yale University. Michael retired from the University of Minnesota in 2016. He currently lives in Chandler, Arizona. In addition to numerous articles in scholarly journals, Michael has published 3 books: Schoenberg's Musical Imagination, Varieties of Musical Irony, and Music's Making, The Poetry of Music and the Music of Poetry. Time and health permitting, a 4th book is in the works. Without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Cherlin.
Okay. Gustav, Mahler, and Arnold Schoenberg were Jewish composers born into German-speaking lands. Mahler, born in 1860 in Bohemia, then part of the Austrian Empire. German was the common language, but the Yiddish of earlier generations was not lost in memory. And I surmise that the German that Mahler heard as a child was inflected with Yiddish idioms, certainly true of the English I heard as a child. There's no evidence that Mahler knew Hebrew, but I find it hard to imagine that he was totally ignorant of the language. Mahler died in Vienna in 1911, just short of his 51st birthday. Schoenberg was born in 1874 in Vienna. So far as I know, Yiddish would have been more remote for Schoenberg than Mahler, yet he must have heard at least some Yiddish in the Vienna of his youth. Like Mahler, Schoenberg had no or very little Hebrew, and when later in life he said Hebrew texts, he relied on others to help him with the language. Schoenberg immigrated to the United States in the fall of 1933. After a short time in Boston, he settled in Los Angeles, where he lived out the remainder of his life. A lifelong triskaidekaphobic, you know that word, triskaidekaphobia? It's the fear of number 13, yeah. Schoenberg was born on September the 13th, 1874, and he died on Friday the 13th in July of 1951. When he would number when he would number measures and scores, he would get to 12A, 12B, 14. That's true. He changed the name of his opera, Moses and Aaron. The normal spelling in German of Aaron is just like in English, 2 A's. He changed it to 1A. Why? Because Moses and Aaron has 13 letters. Okay, before going on with the central ideas of my talk today, I'll begin with a few words about the historical significance of each composer for those who have little or perhaps no experience with their music. Although Mahler had successful performances of his works during his lifetime, he was primarily known as an orchestral conductor. He was revered by Schoenberg, among others, as the greatest performing musician of his generation. Within the universe of classical music, Mahler's significance as a composer continued to augment throughout the century after his death. Mahler's songs, and most significantly his symphonic works, became and remained central to the Western canon. In addition to his remarkable songs, Mahler completed 9 symphonies along with Das Lied von der Erde, the Song of the Earth, a work for voice and orchestra of symphonic proportions completed near the end of his life. Tastes vary, and so it's impossible to pigeonhole Mahler's symphonies in a slot of all-time greats, but to my mind, Mahler as a symphonist is eclipsed only by Beethoven. Remarkably, aside from the songs set for chamber music and voice, Mahler composed no chamber music. In understanding the roots of Schoenberg's music, most scholars agree that the two most important immediate precursors for Schoenberg were Johannes Brahms and Richard Wagner. Wagner, anti-Semite, as you might know. Brahms, the younger of the two by 2 decades, combined conservative elements in his music with progressive ones, a quality recognized by Schoenberg. Brahms was a lively presence in the Vienna of Schoenberg's youth. Many consider Brahms to be the last great representative of Viennese classicism, a lineage that included Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert. In contrast to Brahms, champions of Wagner's music herald that music as the music of the future. While it's impossible to pigeonhole Mahler's musical language, it clearly owes more to Wagner than to Brahms. The Schoenbergian fusion of things Brahmsian and things Wagnerian was radically transformed over time. That's by Schoenberg. To this day, many music lovers, I put that in scare quotes, cannot absorb Schoenberg's mature works. Many find his early music more accessible with its highly chromatic tonality, not that far removed from the musical language of Wagner. Do you all know Mark Twain's comment about Wagner's music? He said that it's not as bad as it sounds. They tell me it's not as bad as it sounds. Okay. I had to throw that in. While dissonance plays an important role in all tonal music, in tonal idioms, dissonance always resolves to a consonant sonority. This resolution is called a perfection. In grammar, perfection indicates a final state, the completion of an act. The musical term is analogous, the resolution of an ongoing flow. Around the year 1908, Schoenberg began composing in a style later called atonality, although Schoenberg preferred the term pantonality, where resolution into a perfection does not occur. If we move from the conception of musical ideas to a wider view of the universe, we may note that physicists have long abandoned the idea of a final state in nature. In a similar way, our psychological states are also without final closure, death aside. We might locate Schoenberg's move to what he called pantonality in this context. After the First World War, a third period of compositional invention emerged for Schoenberg, the invention of his 12-tone method. Schoenberg's central and radical idea was that tempered music's 12 pitch classes, the 12 tones of the chromatic scale along with their octaves, would be given a linear order whose segmentations and permutations would provide all the pitch material for a musical composition. The composer and music theorist Milton Babbitt, taught at Princeton for many years, profound student of Schoenberg's music, named the conceptual shift as one from based on combinations of various pitch subsets to a music based on permutations of a single source idea. For students of Jewish Kabbalah, the idea of permutations of a source idea will resonate with the idea that the Torah has been understood as permutations of the name of God, or names of God. The bulk of Schoenberg's music from the 1920s on is based on this permutational system. Uncanny as it may be, as the 12-tone system emerged, we have no solid evidence that Schoenberg was thinking of the parallels with Jewish mysticism. And yet I wonder. In terms of musical genres, like Mahler, Schoenberg composed a significant number of songs. But in contradistinction to Mahler, aside from 2 chamber symphonies, Schoenberg was not a symphonist. Following the example of Richard Strauss, a German composer who, like Schoenberg, further developed chromatic tonality of Wagner, Schoenberg composed tone poems and opera. Following the lead of Brahms, Schoenberg also composed a significant body of chamber music as well as concerti for soloist and orchestra. In the course of their lives, both Mahler and Schoenberg converted to Christianity. Schoenberg returned to Judaism later in life. Mahler converted to Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, in 1897 at the age of 36. The conversion took place shortly before Mahler assumed his new position as director of the Vienna Court Opera. Being a Catholic was a prerequisite for the job. And director of the Court Opera was, if not the most prestigious appointment in Mahler's musical world, it was certainly among them. The scholarly consensus is that Mahler's conversion was without religious conviction. We might compare his situation to the conversos of 14th and 15th century Spain. Evidently, Mahler sometimes claimed to have converted earlier than he actually had in order to convince people that his conversion was more than opportunism. To my mind, Mahler had too much personal integrity to be characterized merely as a careerist, and so I must surmise that his honesty as a musician allowed him or convinced him to rationalize the dishonesty of conversion as meaningless in the larger scheme of things. Schoenberg's conversion to Lutheranism took place in 1898, about a year after Mahler's conversion. Schoenberg would have been 23 years old. In Schoenberg's case, we do not have a direct link with the job opportunity, and so his motivation is not clear-cut. Anti-Semitism was already on the rise, and this may have been a factor, although a desire to be part of the mainstream of German culture seems more likely. Like Mahler, Schoenberg's musical points of reference were the great Western canon, for Schoenberg most especially those in the Austrian and German tradition. In addition to Wagner and Brahms, Bach, Handel, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, and Schumann were the musical antecedents who mattered most to Schoenberg. Schoenberg's return to Judaism took place in several stages. As early as 1914, Schoenberg began work on an oratorio, Die Jakobsleiter, Jacob's Ladder. Those who follow the annual cycle of Torah readings will recall Jacob's dream from the portion we read only 2 weeks ago. Schoenberg worked on Jacob's Ladder intermittently over the following decades on into his years in California. It was left incomplete at the time of his death. Even earlier than Schoenberg's initial work on Jakobsleiter was his remarkable Gurrlieder. Initially composed in 1900 and 1901, the composition opens with an extraordinary prolonged musical depiction of sunset that brings rest and peace. There's no evidence that Schoenberg was thinking of Shabbat Shalom, and yet one cannot rule out an unconscious association with the Jewish lunar calendar and specifically with welcoming the Sabbath with Friday's sunset. And had I thought of it earlier on, I would have played a part of that piece. It's hard to take short excerpts out of this music because you need the continuity to get a sense of what it is. But if you don't know Schoenberg's music, or if you've been frightened, if you find it like, I can't handle this stuff, this is a really good place to begin. Gurrlieder, it's absolutely gorgeous piece of music. Post-World War I, Germany and Austria were hotbeds for rising anti-Semitism. Someone had to be blamed for the Axis defeat, and the Jews did nicely. In 1921, Schoenberg and his family were denied entry to a summer resort in Matzeh, Austria. The event affected Schoenberg deeply. As was to be the case for so many Jews who had believed they had been integrated into German culture, it took the anti-Semites to remind them that they were Jews. Before the First World War, Schoenberg and the painter Vasily Kandinsky had been close friends. In Kandinsky's book of 1911, Concerning the Spiritual and Art, Kandinsky writes that Schoenberg's music, quote, leads us into the realm where musical experience is a matter not of the air, but of the soul alone, and from this point begins the music of the future, end of the quote. Saying that any music, is not a matter of the air shows a basic misunderstanding, but Kandinsky's high regard for Schoenberg is clear. To his mind, Schoenberg's music supplants Wagner's as the music of the future. After the war, Kandinsky became involved in the Bauhaus initiative in Weimar. This was all different arts working in a association, inviting Schoenberg to join him. Schoenberg had heard of anti-Semitic sentiments among some Bauhaus members. In April 1923, he writes to Kandinsky, and I'm going to quote that letter, "For I have at last learned the lesson that has been forced upon me during this year, and I shall not forget it. It is that I am not a German, not a European, indeed perhaps scarcely even a human being. At least the Europeans prefer the worst of their race to me, but I am a Jew." That's 1923. Zoom ahead 9 years. By the summer of 1932, Schoenberg had fully returned to Judaism in spirit, if not in the letter. That summer, he worked on one of his great masterworks, the most expansive 12-tone work, the opera Moses und Aaron. Schoenberg wrote both the libretto and the music. As the opera opens, let's see if I can get this slide. Right. As the opera opens, Moses stands before the burning bush. The very first thing in the opera, he's before the burning bush. His first words are the divine attributes, einzige, ewige, allgegenwärtige, unsichtbare und unvorstellbare Gott, one eternal, omnipresent, unseeable, and inconceivable God. There's no evidence that Schoenberg knew the writings of Rambam, Moses Maimonides, but it is if he had lifted the attributes from that great medieval Jewish philosopher. As a matter of fact, years ago when I was working on, this was my dissertation piece, when I was working on it, I became convinced he had to have read Maimonides, that he got it from that. But it turns out he didn't have that in his library. So if he knew about him, it was from the coffee shop conversations. That's possible, of course. Interestingly enough, the only Bible Schoenberg had, and he took the Bible very seriously, he says so in his letters, was Martin Luther's German Bible. Martin Luther was an anti-Semite, for those of you who don't know that. Very strange. Okay, so I'm going to play that.
Gott meiner Väter, Gott Abrahams, Isaaks und Jakobs, der du ihren Gedanken in mir wieder erweckt hast. Mein Gott, nötige mich nicht, ihn zu verkünden. Ich bin alt, lass mich in Ruhe meine Schafe weiden.
In the text, yes.
Just want you to mention that Aaron was spelled with 2 A's there.
Yeah, I noticed that in the album cover. Yeah, that's a mistake. You shouldn't have done that. They didn't consult with me. Yeah, you're right. You know, another thing that aggravates me, when Schoenberg immigrated to the United States, he changed his name from O with the umlaut to OE. And I think that should be respected. He had to come here and he changed his name. And when I read European publications about Schoenberg, they always spell with the umlaut. I think it's wrong. That's not right. That wasn't his name anymore. They should respect that change. It wasn't just a change. You know, there's a reason for it. Okay. So what the text that is saying in that bit of the opera is you've gone far enough. Don't go any further. Take your shoes off. It's a paraphrase right out of the Torah. It's a paraphrase right out of the Torah. And then what he says toward the end of the excerpt is, I'll just read it in English instead of the German. God of my fathers, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who has reawoken me in their thoughts in me, has reawoken their thoughts in me. In Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron, except for one 12-note passage where Moses admonishes Aaron to purify his thoughts about God, Moses does not sing. His is a speaking role, or rather a musically inflected speech invented by Schoenberg known as Sprechstimme. In contrast, Aaron is a lyric tenor. The voice of the divine emanation combines speaking and singing, and folk Israel speak and sing. That's remarkable. So the two brothers, one is a speaker, one is a singer. The people are speakers and singers, and the divine voice, whether it's God's voice or some sort of emanation, that's also both of those. Schoenberg's text spoken by Moses at the beginning of the opera as he encounters the burning bush is a near paraphrase of the opposite passage in the Torah, Exodus 3, verse 6. And again, I'll just read that in English. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Yitzchak, the God of Yaakov. So very, very close to the libretto. Composed in the summer of 1932, the music and words stand at the precipice of Hitler's rise to power. Hitler became chancellor some months later, and in 1933, Schoenberg subsequently had to resign his post at the University of Berlin. Mahler had died in 1911, before the First World War and long before the Holocaust. And so while he was the subject of much anti-Semitic diatribe, for instance, ridiculing his physical gestures on the podium, he did not live to experience the destruction of European Judaism. Schoenberg and his family escaped the Holocaust, emigrating to the United States in October of 1933. Before leaving Europe for America, Schoenberg stayed for a short time in Paris, where he officially reconverted to Judaism in July of 1933. The eminent Jewish painter Marc Chagall, most of you know, was a witness to that conversion. To get a better sense of the challenges that Mahler and Schoenberg experienced as Jews immersed in Western culture, alienated from yet attracted to their Jewish heritage, we can draw parallels between them and four of their Jewish German-speaking contemporaries: Sigmund Freud, Walter Benjamin, Franz Kafka, and Gershom Scholem. Each of these men was prominent in his respective field. In varying degrees and in varying ways, each was profoundly grounded in a cosmopolitan European culture and history. And each, in varying degrees and in varying ways, was just as profoundly impacted by his Jewish identity. Reading about the lives of these individuals, and of course so many more, is like variations on a musical theme. A deep background is held in common, while the particulars of each variation are unique. Freud, Jew among Gentiles, argued that Moses was an Egyptian and that Egypt, not Israel, should be credited with the first imagining of monotheism. And yet he clearly self-identified as a Jew. Yosef Yerushalmi, in his book Freud's Moses, a very excellent book, cites a letter that Freud wrote in September of 1883 to Martha Bernays, who was later to become Freud's wife. Read with historical retrospection, the letter is deeply ironic. In translation, it reads in part, quote, I shall try to live more like the Gentiles. Freud's actual word is goyim. It's a loaded word. Modestly learning and practicing the usual things and not striving after discoveries and delving too deep. Wow. Freud is a wishful thinking that the goyim who surround him might not notice he's a Jew. Freud wasn't very good at keeping that secret. As to not striving after discoveries or delving too deep, we can only imagine that the psychic drives that Freud so famously described contravened. His superego said, don't go there. His id demanded otherwise. At all turns, the man who is Shlomo, that's his name, not Sigmund, Shlomo, The man who is Shlomo breaks through the facade of Sigmund, and the would-be European scholar scientist becomes, as no one less than Carl Jung would have it, the inventor of Jewish science. Jung said that. Jung, this guy Carl Jung, a lot of Jewish philosophy people or people interested in that world think highly of him. He was anti-Semite. We have documents that show that. As it turns out, at one point, Gustav Mahler actually consulted with Freud, but the parallels between the two men go far beyond a mutual, if slight, acquaintance. The outsider who would be an insider is profoundly opposite in understanding the struggles of Mahler within the world of late 19th century Vienna. Franz Kafka shares with Schoenberg as well with Freud a fascination with the uncanny, the unheimlich. In fact, we can characterize Freud as the chief theorist of the uncanny, Kafka as its premier literary exponent, and Schoenberg is composing its most accomplished musical embodiments. Mahler, too, has uncanny aspects to his music, and his inescapable self-regard as an outsider looking in is surely unheimlich. Can it be only an accident that among the anti-Semitic tropes of the late 19th and early 20th century, it was commonplace to characterize Jews as outsiders, unheimlich, as uncanny subversive element embedded in European culture? Walter Benjamin, famously in his thesis on the philosophy of history, describes Paul Klee's painting Angelus Novus, and this is a quote. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage. Theodor Adorno recognized something similar in Mahler's music, where the solitary figure resists but is inevitably overwhelmed by Weltlauf, the way of the world, an inexorable, dehumanizing historical force. There are extraordinary passages in Mahler's music where we seem to escape or step out of the ongoing time flow. Adorno names these passages Durchbrüche, breakthroughs, that seem to come from outside the time-space of the ongoing flow of the music. While the word resistance implies a counterforce, an impedance of flow, Mahlerian Durchbrüche are not so much a counterforce as they are temporary suspensions of Weltlauf, moments where we escape the oppressive, overwhelming way of the world. They are kindred to what the French philosopher Michel Foucault called ruptures, a sudden break in the continuity of historical progress. These extended moments of breakthrough have an uncanny feeling of transcendence, of being at peace, a Shabbat Shalom of sorts. And although the words, so far as I know, are not etymologically linked, the second syllable of Durchbrüche sounds suspiciously like the Yiddish Hebrew word for blessing. There's no connection there. It's just a serendipity. It just happens. Like a bubble or a syntactic parenthesis, the breakthrough cannot be sustained. Mahler's moments of blessing are flooded over by the overwhelming catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage. Further light may be shed on Mahler's Durchbrüche and their resonance with things Kafkaesque by considering some of Walter Benjamin's observations about Kafka. In a letter addressed to Gershom Scholem, dated July 12, 1938, Benjamin writes, and I'll quote the letter, Kafka's work represents a tradition falling ill. Wisdom has sometimes been defined as the epic site of truth. Such a definition marks wisdom off as a property of tradition. It is truth in its agotic consistency. It is this consistency of truth that has been lost. This is why in the case of Kafka, we can no longer speak of wisdom. Only the products of its decay remain. There are two. One is the rumor about the true things, a sort of theology passed on by whispers dealing with matters discredited and obsolete. The other product of this diathesis is folly, which to be sure has utterly squandered the substance of wisdom, but preserves its attractiveness and assurance, which rumor invariably lacks. Folly lies at the heart of Kafka's fate. favorites. And that's the end of that quote. The unsustainable breakthroughs of Mahler's musical rhetoric are rumors of a Gothic tradition where the consistency, the sustainability of their truths has been lost. What remains is folly, the attractiveness and assurance of wisdom passed on by whispers discredited and obsolete. Freud defined the uncanny, das Unheimliche, as something that was once familiar, even comforting, that has become strange, unsettling, disturbing. This sense of the uncanny applies to moments in Mahler's music. Robert Alter in his book, how am I doing on time? Robert Alter in his book, Necessary Angels, Traditions in Modernity, Kafka, Benjamin, and Scholem, cites the letter from Walter Benjamin to Gershom Scholem that we've just quoted, and then goes on to write that transmissibility of tradition was crucial for each of the three, Kafka, Benjamin, and Scholem. The transmission of tradition is vital to both composers, Schoenberg and Mahler, and yet is manifest in contrasting ways in the music of Mahler and Schoenberg. Mahler seems to hold on to tradition, but that holding on is deceptive. The anti-Semites of Mahler's world sense this. Schoenberg radically reinvents musical language, yet his music is steeped in tradition nonetheless. His musical language evolves so quickly that listeners are still catching up nearly 100 years later. The image of the outsider looking in is powerfully captured in Mahler's often cited remarks about the scherzo to his Second Symphony. This is the third movement of his Second Symphony. There's bitter irony in Mahler's image of the composer of the dance imagining himself watching the dance from the outside, looking in through a window, quote, without being able to hear the music. And this is a quote from Mahler. The turning and twisting of the couple seems senseless because you're not catching the rhythm that is the key to it all. You must imagine that one who has lost his identity and his happiness, the world looks like this, distorted and crazy, as if reflected in a concave mirror. That's the end of the quote. The music for this moment, by the way, is derived from an earlier song composed by Mahler. The song, St. Anthony is preaching to the fish. The fish listen, but then go on as they were before, unchanged. I wonder what parallels Mahler had in mind. We recall Freud's definition of the uncanny, that which was once familiar, comforting, which has become strange, disturbing. Theodor Adorno's book on Mahler is full of insight opposite to our present discussion. I will quote one short passage, and this is a quote from Adorno. Do you know this guy Adorno, a German Jewish philosopher? This is his only book, I think, about music, and it's quite good. That Mahler was both part of musical culture and a master saturated with its language, yet separate from it, produces the specific atmosphere of his musical language. It is one's colloquial and that of a stranger. A foreigner speaks music fluently, but as if with an accent. That's a very insightful comment. Foreigner speaks music fluently, but as if with an accent. Musical language is seen as if from outside. I'll tell a real quick story because I think I have more than I can fit in today. Mahler's protege was Bruno Walter. Bruno Walter, many of you will know, a very great conductor of the 20th century. At one point, Bruno Walter's parents came to visit Mahler and others in the circle in Vienna. They only spoke Yiddish. And the story is that Bruno Walter was very embarrassed to have these Yiddish-speaking parents meet Mahler. I've known Jews who feel that way about Yiddish. I don't. Adorno uses the word jargon, a German euphemism for Yiddish, to describe Mahler's musical accent. Harold Bloom, in his essay, The Glories of Yiddish, quotes Franz Kafka as saying that Yiddish is a language that consists only of foreign words. I love that. At times, Mahler's Yiddishkeit emerges quite vividly. An example that Leonard Bernstein pointed out in a lecture called The Little Drummer Boy is taken from the third movement of Mahler's First Symphony. Okay. So the music before this passage is that song that we heard at the very end of it. What we know is "Are You Sleeping?" Only Mahler sets it in a minor key. So it sounds like the Yiddish version of "Are You Sleeping?" It's very cool music. Julian Johnson, in his book Mahler's Voices, cites a conversation that Mahler had with the composer Ernst Krenek. Mahler's family lived in that part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire known as Bohemia, linguistically divided between Czech and German. Krenek identified Mahler as a Bohemian, and Mahler, quote, protested, pointing out that he was the offspring of a German family and that his music was German music. According to Krenek, it did not occur to Mahler to call himself and his ancestors Jewish. Right. It occurred to him and he didn't want to say it. In a similar way, in the 1910 interview published in the New York Tribune, Mahler is cited as saying, "Let them call me a Bohemian, yet I am really a German." Perhaps Mahler saw no contradiction between being a Jew and being a German, and yet it seems more likely that he protests too much. Everywhere an intruder, never welcomed. And yet in other ways, especially as his career advanced, Mahler was the ultimate insider. As director of the Vienna Court Opera from 1897 to 1907, Mahler came to hold one of the most prestigious positions in the musical world of his day. Vienna, unsurpassed in the musical life of fin de siècle, Europe was the home of a glorious musical tradition. I've talked about this already. As a performing artist, Mahler was among the most celebrated in Europe, and within the anti-Semitic press among the most conspicuously berated. Evidently, Mahler was particularly demonstrative on the podium. Those of you who are old enough to remember Leonard Bernstein, he was imitating Mahler. There are anti-Semitic cartoons mocking Mahler's gestures and facial expressions. Only an uncouth Jew could behave so preposterously. The 3 times homeless Mahler personifies the outsider who finds himself an insider within the traditions and institutions of a culture that reminds him again and again of his outsider status. As expressed in the pungent irony of Arnold Schoenberg, quote, "He unified all the worst people in Vienna." Isn't that nice? Let me recall from my previous talk the story of Enoch become Metatron. Those who weren't here, this is a story of a cobbler who became an archangel because as he did his work making shoes, when he would think of connecting the upper leather to the sole of the shoe, he thought of connecting the upper worlds to the lower worlds, always meditating on that. And when he dies, he becomes an archangel. The juxtaposition of low and high, the sewing of the soul to the shoe top, is transformed into the transformation of a man into archangel. You'll recall that we mentioned how this juxtaposition of high and low seems to be baked into Jewish folklore, Jewish fiction, and Jewish religious imagery. Spanning the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Gustav Mahler's music shares this juxtaposition of low and high that we find in the Enoch story and in Sholem Aleichem. Many others. I surmise that Mahler's juxtaposition of the banal with the lofty, all on the way to the sublime, are manifestations of his suppressed Yiddishkeit. As we have seen throughout his mature years, Mahler insisted that he was a German and his music was German music. Mahler's orchestration alone betrays the cosmopolitan Jew. Although Mahler learned much from the very German voice of Wagner, his orchestration is not Wagnerian. He may have insisted that he was a German, but to the trained ear, the music doesn't sound German, not Wagnerian, not Brahmsian, not Beethovenian. At the very least, Mahler's orchestra incorporates lessons he learned from the French, Berlioz, and onward, and from Italians as well. Rossini's brilliant use of woodwinds, for example. Add to this Mahler's suppressed Yiddishkeit, and we recognize the one imagining himself as watching the dance from outside, looking in through a window. Mahler never set Yiddish or Hebrew texts. Jewish otherness in European imagination was marked as Oriental. Jews were called Orientals. As close as Mahler ever came toward explicitly recognizing or revealing his Yiddishkeit through music, came near the very end of his life in his remarkable Songs of the Earth, Das Lied von der Erde. The texts for das Lied were based on poems by Li Po, a Chinese poet of the early 8th century. They were translated into German by Mahler's contemporary Hans Bethke. To get a real sense of the various manifestations of suppressed Yiddishkeit in Mahler's music would take far more than a talk could convey. A semester's discussion within a university setting could hardly do justice to the topic. If any of my listeners are curious in that regard, I suggest they turn to the music and see what they discover inside it. While both composers, Mahler and Schoenberg, reimagined the language of music, Schoenberg, on the one hand, seems to be more at home in the world of his precursors, chiefly of Wagner and Brahms, and yet, as self-contradictory as it sounds, Schoenberg's musical imagination took him quantum leaps further in transforming every aspect of music's grammar and modes of expressivity. Am I running too long? Oh, okay, I'm good. Schoenberg's return to Judaism might be better described as a reimagining of what Jewish expression could be. Whereas I hear suppressed Yiddishkeit as underlying much in Mahler, I do not hear Yiddish residues anywhere in Schoenberg's music. However, in contrast to Mahler, where Jewish identity remains subsurface, Schoenberg explicitly expressed his Judaism in a number of works. Among them is 1938 setting of Kol Nidre, commissioned by Rabbi Jacob Sunderling of the Fairfax Temple in Los Angeles. Set for speaker and chorus, the text is all in English except for the opening invocation, which appears in transliteration. Again, I'll just read it in English. By authority of the heavenly tribunal and of the court below. That's very opening in the Kol Nidre. Before the speaker and then chorus speak, and then sing the words of Kol Nidre, Schoenberg's text gives us his version of what he calls a legend from Kabbalah. I quote the opening of this spoken text. The Kabbalah tells a legend. At the beginning, God said, "Let there be light." Out of space, a flame burst out. God crushed that light to atoms. Myriads of sparks are hidden in our world, but not all of us behold them. That's spoken in the piece. To my mind, as much Gnostic as Kabbalistic, the text is musically depicted by the orchestra. Schoenberg, like Mahler, was incredibly gifted and inventive in the use of orchestral colors, and the explosion of light is musically imagined in spectacular ways. I should add parenthetically that there's a version of this piece for organ and voice. If you want to explore it, listen to the orchestra version. It's far superior. You can't make those colors of the crushed light with an organ. You just can't. You need the orchestra. As the work continues, while fragments of the traditional melody for Kol Nidre are woven into the musical texture, yet the music is leagues away from traditional chanting. If listeners know only one of Schoenberg's works on a Jewish theme, it's likely to be A Survivor from Warsaw. The text is a first-person narrative, spoken for the most part in English with German interjections. The work ends with the singing of the first part of the Shema, given in the score in transliteration. You should not be surprised that the pitch structure is far afield from traditional chanting of the prayer. As with all of Schoenberg's reception, listeners' responses to A Survivor from Warsaw vary. My beloved teacher, David Lewin, wonderful, wonderful man, thought the work was pathetic. Others that I know think it's great. The Wikipedia article on the work includes a quote from the Czech novelist Milan Kundera, naming the work as the greatest memorial to the Holocaust ever written. At the very end of his life, Schoenberg was working on the music and text for a set of new psalms. He thought of himself as adding to the 150 that we have. Intermittently and intensifying in the years leading up to and continuing after the Holocaust, Jewish themes become specific. Mahler, on the other hand, struggled with the idea of God, and at least in public went out of his way to obscure his Jewish heritage. And yet, as we have seen, in Adorno's words, his music spoke with an accent. Thank you. So any questions, comments? Sir.
Thank you, sir. couple of questions. So you never use the word klezmer,
Right.
and I
That Mahler one, that could have been klezmer, right?
I believe that klezmer was Mahler's thread that said, "This is what being Jewish is about,"
Mm.
as you said, from seeing from the inside and outside.
There's a story, just to interject real
Mhm.
quickly, sorry, of him meeting with a cantor, and the cantor, I guess he had heard the cantor singing or something. Or I know the cantor is doing stuff
Mhm.
with Mahler, and Mahler reacts. He's overwhelmed by the beauty of this tradition. So it is. I totally agree with you. It is klezmer, but it's also that
Right.
more too. Yeah.
I happened to hear Michael Tilson Thomas in a lecture on this, and what stands out is that when you grow up in a small community in those places, you hear music, you learn music from what you hear in the community. So weddings, funerals, dances, and all that, and then the government, and then the enemy. And I think Mahler does an amazing job of all that. Anyway, Schoenberg, I just he changed music, and I think from a physics point of view, from a intelligence point of view, his place, and it's tough stuff. I mean, I've had to. It's like taking too many laxatives and then trying to get into, and so I have forced myself. But I get it, because you wouldn't have had Aaron Copland, you wouldn't have had all the antecedents that allowed for that. Anyway, I appreciate your comments.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, you're so right about Schoenberg. He's so radically transformed music. And I think I tried to point this out in the paper. The kind of irony is how deeply grounded he was in these precursors.
Where else do you come from?
Exactly. Right. So you can't further a tradition without knowing that tradition in the first place. It's funny. You would think he would be knowledgeable about science in general, but everything that I understand about him, that he was quite naive. So it was purely a musical imagination. He confused, for instance, astronomy and astrology. Yeah, he confused the two. Yeah. Okay. So So yeah. Bernstein in the lecture I alluded to, the little drummer boy thing, he that passage yada that ya ba da ba da ba da da ba da that thing, he associates that with klezmer.
Yeah.
He makes it explicit. I think he's right. So, other thoughts or comments?
I don't need a microphone. Oh, but it's for the online audience. Oh,
Good afternoon. In terms of Schoenberg living in LA, did he do any movie scores? And if so, I assume they would not have been atonal.
There is a wonderful story. I think it was Jack Warner. I'm pretty sure it was Jack Warner that he met with, and he was explaining to Warner how you had to make the movie based on how the music went. So you start with the music and then you choreograph the movie around. Okay, and he didn't get the contract. But there is a student of Schoenberg's who did write a lot of, and his name, maybe somebody remember. I can't think his name. It'll come to me as soon as I go home. Famous kind of, who wrote. Do you know Stan? Does that ring a bell? No. There's somebody that studied with Schoenberg, studied composition, and then he went on to be a successful movie. At least he wrote some scores for movies. But Schoenberg himself, no, he did a lot of teaching. No, I didn't mention this in my paper. If it's hard to make a list of who are the great composers of the first half of the 20th century because people disagree, and I get that. But to my mind, three of the top 10, let's say, are Schoenberg and his two students, Alban Berg and Anton Weber. There's no composer aside from J.S. Bach who was as successful as a teacher as Schoenberg was. And of course, that's a very Jewish thing too, right? When you learn, you also teach. And not that it's only Jewish, it could be anything, but he was evidently a very remarkable teacher. Many students went on to very successful careers.
In the meantime, I just want to remind everybody online that they can also ask questions, to please put their questions in the Q&A for those of you online.
In terms of Mahler, how do you explain his German and the fact he fled to New York to become the conductor of the New York Philharmonic?
Yeah, the only thing I mean, it's hard to explain. It's the truth of it. But I think it's analogous to when, Bruno Walter brought his parents and he was embarrassed because they spoke Yiddish. So Mahler, he couldn't get past that, evidently. Why would he keep insisting, no Jew here? Well, totally German, I mean, when it's so obvious to the anti-Semites and to anybody who just listen to some of his music and you're hearing it. I heard it as a teenager when I was first learning Mahler's music. It was instant recognition that, wow, this is different, from Beethoven or Mozart or whatever. I'm not answering your question, or am I getting close?
Orchestral world, I think in the orchestral world, to be invited to the New York Philharmonic, look what's happening in LA right now with Dudamel, the man who will be known to have helped Mahler more than anybody than Bernstein. He has to take that gig. And the same with Mahler. I think there was so much anti-Semitism. They made him so uncomfortable to go to New York City where there were Jews. I mean, he actually, in the overtures to getting him, to wooing him, they were very smart. I mean, they had some very prominent Jews, be part of the committee that invited him. So
it's such a shame we don't have recordings of Mahler. It's a really profound shame. I mean, I'd love to hear what he did. I'm assuming that when we hear Bruno Walter, there's a lot of Mahler in his voice. I mean, he studied with Mahler. He was Mahler's assistant. Bruno Walter, those who don't know, was a wonderful conductor of this, and he's got some very distinguished recordings of Mahler's music, but also Beethoven and Mozart, and the whole.
He wrote a book about Mahler.
Pardon me?
He wrote a book about Mahler, a small book.
Did I don't know.
Yeah,
he did. He
back and forth.
Oh, okay. I don't think I know that. Yeah. I want to mention this. There's just a quick thing. So Mahler had a workplace. It was like a little shed in back of his home where he would compose, so he could be isolated. And this is what I've read. I didn't visit it, so I don't, but I've read. The only books that he kept in that workplace were the collected works of Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher. He had no Bibles, no Immanuel Kant. Kant's categorical imperative is famous in philosophy, is kind of a paraphrase of Rabbi Hillel's golden rule. It's a philosophical version of the same idea. And I wonder if that's why Kant resonated so much for the Jews, the cosmopolitan Jews, learned cosmopolitan Jews of Mahler's generation. I do find that remarkable that was the only books that he kept where he composed. Yeah.
Anyone else? Anything online?
Thank you very much, Professor
Thank you.
Cherlin. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you.